Okay. I say we get started, Sab.
Sounds great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us again for another episode of Freerun, where we're going to be chatting about all the ever-changing landscape of the food and beverage industry. So I'm here today with my co-hosts, Dustin Wilson and Mike Laszlo. And it's been a interesting couple of weeks since we started doing this. I think it's almost about a month now. And if this week continues on that trend, it's already looking like it's going to be an interesting one. Last week we had businesses, both large and small, receiving the PPP. We had some businesses giving it back. And then today there was another round of PPP that the process began, and the system crashed this afternoon. So
right away.
With it, there will be a lot more conversations and deep diving into what that is. But with the PPP, now that a lot of folks that have applied and received it are starting to actually see that money, they're starting to strategize about what to do with it, reading the fine print. And today, that's what we're going to be talking about to kick things off. And we also have states that are starting to open up and lighten the restrictions. So as restaurants begin to look ahead to that, what can they expect or how can they approach that? And I think there's a lot of learnings to be had both in the United States and beyond. So we'll touch on that as well. But let's start from the top there. And as we look at PPP, and if you've received it, how do you really dive into understanding how to put it to use, what can be forgiven, and things like that? Dustin and Mike, just putting it out to you all. Yeah. Think about the acceptable uses. We'll start high. Where do you see that?
So, when you look at this, I think we're all pretty comfortable with what this is designed for and what we're allowed to use it for. The most important thing, of course, being payroll costs, which does include your benefits. You can also use this money for interest on mortgage, your mortgage payments, so long as anything incurred before February 15th of this year, rent under any agreements that were enforced before February 15th of this year.
Just real quick, I may have misheard. It's interest on mortgage payments, not the mortgage principal.
Sorry, or interest on mortgage payments. Yes, that's what I meant. Rent, of course, and your utilities, which, so long as service began before February 15th of this year. So those are the things that you are able to use it for. Keep in mind, though, that if and when you bring on employees for payroll, you are still responsible for your payroll taxes on that. So just keep that in mind as you bring people back on. So
yeah, I think that's real quick. I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I think that's a really important point. Because a lot of my clients and just friends and people I know are thinking, well, I just pay somebody with a no-show job just so I can meet that 75%. That is one way to think about it. But Dustin makes a great point. You still have to pay those taxes, the Social Security and the income and the employment tax. And so it's not free money. You got to be really careful about that.
Yeah, I agree. And, so when I look at this, as a business owner, I look at this and I start to think, all right, what's kind of the best way to use this money? And I think the first thing you need to think about, or that I would be thinking about, is, do I want this forgiven or not? Or if I do want it forgiven, how much do I want to apply to be forgiven? Which I know we're going to get into forgiveness a little bit more, but I think that's kind of the first question that you need to ask yourself, right? Because if you're designing your whole strategy around trying to get forgiven for as much of this as possible, to me, I look at this and it makes it really difficult to do, particularly for restaurants, right? Because you have to hit all these payroll numbers, you have to hit your FTE numbers to get back to your FTE numbers, as well as using 75% of this for payroll is a pretty difficult thing to do, right? Especially when, a lot of your staff doesn't really have much to do at the moment. So what are you going to hire your servers back on and have them sit around, pay them to train or study or find random things for them to do? It makes it really difficult. Not to mention the fact that, I'm hearing from restaurateurs around the city, these people are happy on unemployment right now. They're making more money oftentimes on unemployment sometimes than they are, in the restaurants. Given the CARES stimulus, they're getting an extra $600 per week on top of the unemployment benefits until the end of July. So you got to make a pretty convincing case as an employer on the dollars side to get them back in the door in the first place.
Yeah.
So, financially for them, it kind of makes sense to stay home. It makes it really difficult for you to hit those the forgiveness threshold numbers. So I take a step back and I look at this. I'm like, all right, well, maybe I'm thinking about this in a different way. I want to think about how else I can use this money for my business. Let those guys stay home and maybe reallocate some funds to other things, and only apply for a smaller amount of forgiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Something I heard earlier today, and I think this is the way I would look at it, is put your business first. Think about your business needs first. Save the ship, and then that'll have a place for the employees to be when we get through this. But if you're not looking at it from the lens of how do I keep my business afloat, and then saying how do I use these funds, you're not doing it. I just don't think you're doing it right. If we're looking at it as I got this loan, how do I get it forgiven? Well, it's just a pass through at that point, and maybe you get a little benefit, but the goal here is to keep your business alive. And I also think, and Saab and Dustin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you're thinking I want to keep my business alive as it was in January, you're probably doing it wrong. You need to be thinking, how am I going to change, and what is my new business plan, and how am I going to operate at 50% or 30%, come June 1, July 1, August 1, if I'm lucky. And then how does the PPP fit into that?
Right. And with the PPP, I think we can all say that there's so much vagueness about it, and there's so much confusion in terms of how it's interpreted, and not all of us get the enjoyment of reading thick legal documents like you do, Mike.
That's great.
And because of that, I think it is important that setting it up from the get-go to be as clean as possible, and using it for the specified uses, but also even just putting it in a separate account from the get-go to make sure that you can document all the uses. It's very clear. So when it does come time for the forgiveness, it's all traceable and laid out right there. But when you start looking at the hurdles and obstacles that you face, I think we can all agree that it's not necessarily designed for restaurants that aren't open right now. And that's when we most need the support. So how do you actually use it for that? And Dustin, I've heard also, like you were saying, a lot of people saying the unemployment challenge, and the fact that employees are making more on unemployment than they would if you brought them back. And I think you can think of that a little bit creatively, perhaps, when it comes to getting your FTE count up and overcoming that. I think if that's the route you want to go, I think there are other ways of doing it, in terms of, obviously you can bring people back, and there's the odd jobs, there's the painting, there's the deep cleaning and things like that. But is there a way where you could also potentially do bonuses? So let's say, it's a busser that's, getting, normally gets 15, 20 bucks an hour, but they get $5 more on the unemployment. Well, is there a way to pay them that same hourly rate that they received when they were working and the restaurant was open, and then truing them up at the end with a bonus with that, provided they do little tasks on the side. So I think you can get creative, or if there's a part-time individual, do you hire them back full-time for this time to help true up that FTE count? I think those are a couple ways of potentially looking at it.
And so I think it's important to note with what you just said about truing up the FTE account. It's important, again, when you're evaluating right now how to use PPP, that part of that forgiveness amount is going to be, it can be reduced. I'm sorry, the total forgiveness amount can be reduced, and we're going to get to this in just one moment, by the amount of FTEs you did not bring back. So if you went in with 10 full-time employees, and on June 30th, you only have 8, there's going to be a reduction in your forgiveness of 20%. So let me bring this up here. I guess
also, I think when we're looking at it right now, and obviously some people's 8-week clock is ticking, but we also know that the timeline for forgiveness hits on June 30th. So while it may not be applying to you right now, it could get to a point when you can see a little more clearly on the horizon in terms of when you might be opening, that how you could actually apply this to the your reopening strategy. So it may not be applying to you today, but you may be able to use it at the end and then be saying, wow, I'm looking at this very differently because I can have this forgiven if I can put some of my pre-opening expenses in here, my labor with that.
Yeah, I think for me, I kind of look at it, and I think Mike put it really well, is, let's say I'm getting a couple $100,000 here. I'm getting money from the government in my bank account. I've got a few $100,000. Separate that out, put it in a separate account so you can track everything really easily. But then take a moment and think about, what are the needs of my business? I think if you look at this strictly from like, oh, I want to use this so that I can get as much of it forgiven as possible, I don't know if that's a winning strategy for restaurants. I think you need to look at it like, how can I best use this cash to keep my business alive? Then when it comes time to look for forgiveness, we'll use the calculator here. Think about how much of that you want to be forgiven, and then maybe how much you want to keep on as that low interest loan.
Yeah, and I've just, let me know if you can see my screen.
You can see it, Mike.
Okay, just to walk through some general ideas. And again, these are the things we should be looking at going into how we're going to use it, and then how we're going to have it forgiven. And keep in mind that the rules are not finalized, but we believe that these are very close, or at least something to we can lean on these for guidance now. So the first point here is up to the full amount of the principal amount of the loan plus the accrued interest can be forgiven. So that's that number. Let's say we borrowed $150,000. That entire portion, that entire loan can be forgiven if up to at least 75% is used on payroll costs. And that's not just payroll, but also the benefits that may go along with the payroll. But again, keep in mind, it does not include the taxes you have to pay. So that is an expense you're just going to have to bear out of pocket. Then we get into the 25% non-payroll costs. Those are utilities, rent, just everything that Dustin was speaking about earlier. That's very important to keep in mind, because you can't just go spend dollars on marketing or spend dollars on food products or alcohol. That's not going to come in. And that's a serious problem for a lot of restaurants that are looking to reopen, really from scratch in a lot of cases. Then we're going to get that number, and it's going to be reduced by the average full-time employees that we currently have, which is a number that we're going to get to here in a second. And then also the reduction in salaries. And this is very important. I've been asked a lot of questions about this. Is if I have a chef who's making $150,000 a year, can I pay him, can I pay him less? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. So you would have put that number into the calculation to get the PPP loan at $100,000. That was the cap. You're not allowed to have more than that. So automatically that chef's salary for purposes of PPP is $100,000. So you can actually reduce that by 25%. So you can actually reduce that salary without penalty to $75,000. So here's an example. We have a loan amount of $150,000 and it's funded on April 20th. And we went in with 10 full-time employees equivalents. We did 75,000 in payroll in 8 weeks. That's April 20th to June 20th. We did 25,000 in non-payroll. So you can see here we have $100,000 that we've used for acceptable uses. For whatever reason, we weren't able to use the other 50. As a part of this, we retained 8 full-time employees, the equivalents of 8 full-time employees, which the IRS defines as anything above an average of 30 hours per month. But again, really, it's going to be that number that you came in
per week.
I'm sorry, that's right. You're right. On a monthly basis, 30 hours per week. Then we have a chef salary that we reduced to $75,000. So you see here that we're going to have $100,000 times 0.8. That's that FTE number. And we're going to have a loan forgiveness of $80,000. Therefore, when we go to seek forgiveness, we're going to have forgiven $80,000. We're going to be left with a $70,000 loan over 2 years at 1% interest. The question really becomes, and Dustin, this is what you were talking about earlier. What do we get to do with that 70? We're having a large debate about this kind of internally, because the purpose of the loan is that you say to the government, I'm going to use this money for payroll and other covered expenses. Can I go use this money for something else? The jury is out on that, unfortunately.
Now, Mike, as you went through,
it's a little misleading, I want to say, because you don't actually have 70,000 left over. You've already used 20 of that. So you actually have 50 left over in this example.
Okay.
But Mike, as you were talking through that, two things came to mind. If you don't have a restaurant that's up and running and operating, you should not try and just bring people back to bring them back, because again, that's actually costing you money.
Right.
Probably more than 1%. So it's an out-of-pocket expense that you're going to have to go into debt even more so on. So unless you actually need them, I wouldn't try padding it at this point in time.
I agree.
But to figure out creative ways of using it, and if you can use it for rent, and we've talked about some of the challenges people might be having negotiating their leases or renegotiating their leases with landlords. Could you actually use this money and have a conversation with your landlord who is unsure if you or other tenants might even be paying him, or for the time while you're closed, or when you reopen? Could you actually use that as a way of saying, hey, we will pay you for the months, these past 2-3 months, and in exchange for that, we'd like to get a more favorable terms on our lease? Or could we actually use that to prepay some of that for the upcoming rent and get better terms?
I think so. Again, it's the purpose of the loan is for payroll, utilities, rent, all of these things. Let's say we don't use it in the 8 weeks to get forgiveness. We're still going to use it on a covered cost, which would be rent. So we go to our landlord and say, I have $100,000. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's give me a huge discount or a fair discount on the next 6 months or a year of rent for this $100,000. And that is better spent giving it to the landlord and then paying back the loan over 2 years at 1%, which doesn't even start for 6 months.
Right.
That might be a great use of the money on an expense that we're allowed to use under the loan, which is the rent. Right. And the other thing, real quick, I'm sorry, Dustin, but real quick, the other point is, for instance, in Colorado, we are allowed to prepay wages under the law. Now, this is federal money, but our state law with employment, with wages allows us to prepay with no problem. So there would be a good argument that let's prepay some wages and have it come under the forgivable amount. I can make no guarantees that will actually be forgiven, but it's still an acceptable use of that money, and there's a chance that it would be forgiven if used in that 8 weeks. So another thing to consider.
And if I was looking at this, and while it may not apply to me today because I'm not even ready to open, but let's say that before the 2 weeks before the forgiveness term expires, I might start looking to ramp up. I'd be looking to say, okay, what is it actually going to cost me? Let's look at the staffing, for training and pre-opening, so I could understand what that amount was, and then also look to say, how can I spend the 25% additional of that to submit that for forgiveness? Would that be correct, Mike?
Yeah. Real quick, I'm sorry, I was just reading a question from Rob Intner, who was asking, he heard that there were going to be new rules about forgiveness. So Rob, I saw this late last night. SBA put out a new Q&A, and it was just one more, and it was about FTEs. Other than that, I have not seen a new rule today. I've read news reports that there are going to be additional qualifications for people taking the money, and that lenders could look into whether you actually had another source to get through this time period. I've seen no official guidance on that. If somebody has it, I'd love to see it. But I've checked Treasury, SBA websites, and while they've been updated even up to the last few hours, I haven't seen anything in the way of a new rule, and I have looked.
With benefits, Mike, I'm just thinking about that too, again, creatively, and I could be way off base by saying some of these. So I'm talking to a lawyer, hence you. But with benefits, is there a way that you could use this to help your employees when they come back with benefits in a different manner? Or you were talking about being able to prepay. Could you pay a sign-on bonus that could help them with their, with benefits and health insurance, for example, upon being rehired?
I think potentially we need to look and see what constitutes payroll cost under the rule, under the statute. And if you can fit a payment into a payroll cost definition, into the definition, I think you have a good faith argument and a good faith basis as to why that should be part of the forgiven amount. And it's going to depend on each individual lender. They're going to be the gatekeeper to what is forgiven. I think ultimately the SBA is going to sign off on what the lender says. So if you're able to properly document and, in a sense, convince the lender that this is a forgivable amount or is a forgivable expense, then I think it will work. I think, again, it's going to be a level of good faith. And, so if I'm in your situation, Saab, and I'm looking at it, I'm saying, what can I do? I might say, well, look, how much can I get into the bonus world? How much can I get into the payroll world? Because those are traditional wages. If I'm buying people a car or buying somebody new electronics or something that maybe I'm going to pass off as, or maybe even a legitimate business expense, I don't think that's going to work. But if I say, here's a $5,000 bonus, you didn't have to come back to my restaurant, but you did. We appreciate that. Your loyalty has been recognized. And this is a good faith bonus paid to you for coming back in a very difficult time, and with the expectation that you're going to be here for the next 3 months. I don't see why that wouldn't count as a payroll cost, as a signing bonus or as a transition bonus to coming back to, if you're in a resort town, come back to the resort town. There's a reason for you to come back. That to me is an incentive, a legitimate payroll cost incentive. And I would be looking at that.
Are we setting ourselves up for a very controversial July when everyone starts
absolutely
their forgiveness documents? And
that's the tricky part, right? Because you actually, the end of the 8 weeks, you're looking at trying to re-up your FTE numbers by the end of June, but the CARES Act additional money for unemployment lasts until the end of July. So there's a month gap there too, where it's very beneficial for a lot of these workers to continue to just stay home. It's going to be tricky to try to get your numbers back up in time.
It is, and I think that's maybe where that bonus comes in. It's like, hey, look, I know you're getting this extra 600. Why don't I give you 750? You jump off for the last month and come back, and you have to do something. I mean, the sheer fact that you've offered a job should kick the employee off of unemployment. But what I understand at this point is most people are just being very polite and saying, hey, would you like to come back? Instead of actually extending the offer. And what they're being told is no. But that's right now. Come to the end of that period when they only have 1 month left of that, that nice money. Is there some way to say, hey, look, that you're being short-sighted here. Don't take the 600 in the unemployment. I think the 12 or whatever the case may be. And I will pay, that'll be your bonus, get you over that last month and incentivize you to come back and stay. I think you should be doing that. I think you should be looking at that. When I say I think you should be doing it, I mean to say I think you should be looking at it.
Yeah, I think you need to look at it from a really holistic point of view. And I know, Salvatore, we're going to get into some reopening strategies here in a second, and really think about what your timeline is to reopen, who you actually need on staff, what you need to be paying people for, and allocating those funds accordingly. And then, then you'll have a better idea as to what you want to apply for forgiveness. So it's like, to the point you're making earlier, Mike, if I get a $300,000 loan, but I only really need to use 100,000 of it, that becomes my forgivable amount, correct, that I can apply for.
Yep.
So you don't have to use all of it for these resources in those 8 weeks. Just whatever is not used becomes the loan.
That's right.
And I would, so just hopping ahead to, well, you might not be able to bring back all your employees. And I think you mentioned earlier, Mike, there's almost no way that you could have the same staffing levels going into this or coming out of this as you did going into it, and have because you're not going to have the volume, your business has changed dramatically. It's a whole different world. But how do you use that, or who are the people you should bring back on board? And I think that you could really get some ROI on this in terms of long-term. And that's where I kind of referred to that quarantine cabinet. And I was doing some thinking, and there's probably 6 buckets that I would say are key positions or areas of focus that you'd want to have on that. And whether it's one person for each, or maybe you cross over, but I would say looking at finance, looking at someone that's looking at pivoting, the operation in some way, someone that's focused on recruitment and staffing, somebody that's focused on communications, and that's both internal and external, and then also health and safety, and then just thinking about hospitality and service. Those, in my mind, are the 6 buckets of the key decisions you're gonna have to make. And the more people around the table talking about that now and strategizing, when the time comes to flip the switch, you're gonna have everything hopefully in a much better place to just plug and play when you start bringing employees on. Because I know opening restaurants, it's, oh great, we're getting so much done. But then as soon as you start bringing employees on, you almost become a babysitter at that point in time and have to find things to do and manage people. But, you know, I do think we'll kind of talk through these a little bit, but finance, you know, I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts, but I'm thinking of somebody that's looking at, okay, where are we with our accounts payable? Where are we with cash flow, rebudgeting? And, you know, when we come out of this, do we have the real-time reporting that's set up for our teams to really make in-the-moment decisions? What else would someone that's focused on finance do in your guys' eyes?
So I'll jump in for a second here. I think that finance person and the pivot person, whoever those people are, would probably have to work together pretty closely as well. Obviously, the business model is going to need to change a little bit, and you're going to need somebody on the finance side that's going to help to model that out and see what it looks like, right? So if you're trying to implement more of a to-go or delivery model or takeaway or whatever you want to call it, you need to see what the implications are and how much of that you need to drive revenue-wise. And so the pivot person is going to be probably more of your operational person. The finance person is going to want to work with that one to make sure that the money pans out.
Yeah, I think you need to be with that. And this goes to the quarantine cabinet, which, by the way, I love the idea. If you have the team around you, or you have the potential to build it. Because again, you're not the restaurant you were or the business you were 2 months ago, and you probably never will be again. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to survive and how we're going to live. And states are coming online. We know Georgia came online on Friday. Colorado is starting to come online today. We know a lot of states are coming back online. And so, but what is that going to look like? 20% occupancy? I think you guys were telling me the other day, 5 people per square, certain amount of square footage. It's not even now going to be like a table count. It's going to be a per square footage. How do we even address that? So if our cabinet's not looking at building a new business model, I mean, maybe a completely new business model at 50% levels through the next year, you're doing it wrong. And then you start to look at how can I survive at 50%? And if I can, okay, what can I do to add on top of that? And I need to be looking at that right now as I'm about to spend my PPP money. I need to be looking at that. And then you start to talk about, okay, what does it look like when we're allowed to go to 100%? Are we actually going to be doing 100% business? And how do I make that work? A lot of the revenue streams available to restaurants right now are going to go away. Well, maybe not a lot, but some. One big one, alcohol. That is going to go away at some point. I don't know when.
Off-premise alcohol sales.
What's that?
Off-premise alcohol.
That's what I meant. And I apologize. Yeah, off-premise is going to go away. So if our business model right now is take-home meal kits or takeaway or tacos and margaritas to go, that is great. But can I really build a business model on that when I don't know if we'll be here in 60 days? I mean, the answer is yes yes with a choose your own adventure when the order ends. So those are things I'm saying you have to be looking at right now. You have to be business planning this.
And I think that shows sort of the crossover between these positions and the dialogue that has to be happened. Nobody can operate within silos. So if you're talking about that person that's focusing on pivoting, I think you have to look at list all the options of ways to pivot. You cost out the finance folks, and then you kind of order a la carte off of it. Maybe you phase some in, but I think traditionally most chefs don't cost out every single dish and just sort of hedge it a little bit. But I do think as you look at this, it's really important that you're costing out every single menu item. And also if you're doing to go, what are the disposables that go along with it? And those are the
question for you. If I know I'm going to open June 1, am I opening with the same menu?
No.
What's different? And
I don't.
remember, I've never run a restaurant. I mean, I just don't know.
Sure, I think you have to look at it a couple ways. First of all, the volume's not going to be there, and as a result, your revenue is not going to be there. So you have to also shift your cost structure. And so one thing to do that is obviously labor is one of the largest. So you're going to have a smaller team, and a smaller team, you can't necessarily produce as much. And to have 20 items on a menu, maybe you go down to 10. Maybe there's a different format that you do. Maybe it's a prefix. It's also looking at those and saying, okay, is everything on there really a profitable item that's contributing to the overall success of the business? So I think you'll see smaller menus, and in terms of the number of selections, and also shorter, just from the sense of, if I need to turn my tables twice as much, I can't afford to have people sitting there for 3 hours. So do I create a menu that actually gets them in and out for an hour and a half or 2 hours, so I can get another turn on there as well and get some built-in efficiency with it? Less waste, things like that. You really have to look at it completely different.
Do you think that prefix is going to be a more common in this scenario, less common, or not really even either one?
Well, I think when you say prefix, I think oftentimes people think of fine dining, 7-course tasting menus, but I do think there's creative ways to do prefixes that can actually, we do Restaurant Week here in New York twice a year, and that's something that New Yorkers really enjoy. It's a chance for them to eat at restaurants they couldn't normally go to, or they might not have an opportunity due to pricing, or just, hey, let's go try something, and it's a low bar to entry. I think that can really win people over. It streamlines it, and you still give them choices within it. It's not a completely fixed one, but in a more affordable price point than the full-on 7-course degustation that we might have remembered from years before.
Yeah.
To the recruiting and staffing, this is, I think, something, we're talking about how you bring people on. And when you have social distancing measures still in effect, how you recruit, how you hire, and how you train people remotely and at scale is going to be really something you have to think about. And also knowing that anytime you're opening up a restaurant, the way I see it is that you can't assume that these are the exact same employees that were here before. So you have to plan it as it's a brand new restaurant opening. And so what are your training materials? Because you also have to train even the people that have been there before on what's new, what's different, how to handle guests and hospitality in this way, if you have to wear a mask and sanitation procedures. So I think there's really a whole overhaul of the training programs that have to be created, not just for the opening, but in perpetuity moving forward. So being able to have,
you're also getting, if you're getting a new batch of employees, you're getting them into the company culture. You're talking to them about your values as a business. They need to start drinking some of the Kool-Aid, so to speak, before things get open, that your staff before had already knew and understood. So it's developing that culture all over again. And, in some cases that could be a great opportunity, right? It could be a great time for a clean slate, start things off on a better foot, maybe clean up some areas that maybe weren't great in the past. But, if you had an excellent culture before all this happened, you got to just be careful. You can't expect necessarily that when everything comes back that it's just going to return to normal, like that. You have to put some effort into it.
Well,
I think, yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, putting back your CEO restaurant hat on, as we get to go back, the food's going to be one thing, of course, but what about protecting the employee? How are you thinking about right now? How can I even get people back in my restaurant safely? One, what is safely? And let's just talk about masks. That's what's on everybody's mind. How do you, as a CEO, how are you dealing with that?
Well, I think you bring up a great point in, doing some reading about how people are handling this. And I think we're going to see a lot of this as Atlanta or Georgia and Alaska, Oklahoma, as you mentioned, they're back up and running, and then you have other states following on how people handle this, because I think, you've heard about people taking temperatures of employees when they come into work, having PPEs on all employees. So a couple of things come up to my mind that I'm concerned about, saying, okay, how do you address this from a employment law practice? And I got to think, what you do for one employee, you have to do for every employee every single time. And I believe you can't do it prior to the offer, but after the offer, you could say your offer is conditioned upon this, being able to have a temperature at whatever level that is, not a fever, but you have to do it for every employee every single day and have to track that. But the catch is you can't track it in the same manner you would track other things because that's medical information. So it's separate files where you would keep that log. I mean, how do you see just looking at the temperature checks for employees?
It's very annoying to think about that you would walk. Let's just talk about the employee first, then we'll talk about the guest. But as an employee, I walk in, and who's gonna take my temperature? Likely with one of these little, almost like a flashlight deal that I use on my kids. You hit the middle of the forehead, and it tells you the temperature. Well, who's going to do that? Is it going to be a manager? And then how do we know that the testing is done properly? And what if I get a bad reading? And I get one bad reading? Is it best 2 out of 3? Is it best 3 out of 5? This could be pretty annoying. And what if you have an employee that says, I don't want you to do it. You're not going to do it. You send them home? Probably. Do you, I mean, there's going to be so many issues here. And one of the big things you hit on, and I think Amazon's dealing with this right now, is, well, once you've got that data, you've tied it to a person, how do you keep it safe? You've got HIPAA laws. And then who has access to that information? Can the government subpoena that information? And now all of a sudden the government's subpoena employment records, which it's allowed to do in certain scenarios. And now it's got my health information right there. I mean, these might seem like trivial or silly things, but it's very important. In a restaurant setting, we often see employees come in and we believe they might be intoxicated. Well, we're allowed to give them a breathalyzer, and it's a private business, and we can say give a breathalyzer, and they either have to do it or we can make our decision. That could be health information. We look at it, we see that the blood alcohol content's a certain amount, we say, okay, you're done, or fine, you passed. I mean, these are similar concepts. Each city, each state are going to have different rules, but it's important. But then let's get to the guest. One
other thing I would say, just the safest thing on the employee in my mind is clarity and consistency. And it's making sure that every manager understands what that is. Every employee understands, and it's something that you're transparent with up front, and that there's a consistent way that you're doing it every single shift for every single individual, what you're doing with those, and are you destroying them, however that is done, but done consistently across.
It has to be done. That's right. And that's the number one thing. It's the same thing with random drug tests. Random drug tests are okay, but they have to be truly random, or they have to be uniform and everybody gets one. And so you can't pick out people based on race, gender, anything else. You have to just say third person in the door gets a temperature test. We don't care who it is. That's what's going to happen. That is, a random, very unbiased, fair approach. I'm thinking out loud, and I'm going to regret this, but part of my concern would be I have a warm restaurant in the summer, and the doors are open, the patio, it's 90 degrees, the sun beating down. Somebody comes in and they look like they've got a fever, and sure enough, I take their temperature, and they've been in the sun all afternoon. And
they rode the bike to work or whatever.
Yeah, they rode a bike to work. They come in the door, and they're running a fever, but they don't have a fever, but the skin temperature is hot. Well, I got to send them home, but they're totally fine.
But that could also be in your policy. It's saying if you get a high reading, and a high reading is anything over 100 degrees, then you can retest 2 other times within, given minutes. And then, but again, it's consistent across the board. And I'm not the medical expert, but I do think there's probably some information where there will be some best practices that'll be coming up from that. You and I have had conversation though, Mike, about PPEs, and that's something where we've heard anywhere from independent restaurants, a single unit could cost annually $300,000, and I've heard a restaurant group that has 15 restaurants, 1.5 million over the course of a year in terms of additional costs for that type of equipment.
Then there's the issue of who pays for it and who's required to pay for it.
And my take on it, I think this is where it gets a little bit gray, and I don't think there's it depends what precedent you look at, but I think in the front of house, you have to provide that. It's almost like as part of a uniform, and if we want you to wear a certain tie, we're going to buy that tie, we're going to give it to you. But for me, in the back of house, if we're trying to want to make sure everybody's safe first and foremost, but also if you're looking at costs, are there other ways of being a little bit creative with that. We say that employees have to wear non-slip shoes and they have to provide those. If a PPE is required in the back of house, could you give some guidelines as to what type of mask they would have to wear? And it's a bring your own mask, because in New York, you have to wear a mask if you're in public. So I assume that every employee coming to work would be in public, so they would have to have one. Could they utilize that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very unique tying of public order versus private business, where, yeah, you're ordered to wear a face mask in public, and I'm going to go into a private restaurant, which is a public accommodation, under the law, and I have to wear one. But then you get into this situation of, all right, I'm going to bring in a raggedy face mask that I made myself, and you don't know if I've actually washed it. Mm-hmm. And I'm selling, expensive dinners or even just dinners, and I don't want my customers to think
plating your dinner.
What's that?
Or I'm plating your dinner.
I'm plating your dinner with a mask that we can't verify is actually clean. So right. Then as a restaurateur, I want to give you a clean mask that I know is clean. And I think, and the other issue is, and Salvatore, you hit on this, OSHA, if you look at their COVID guidelines, it may be that OSHA expects restaurateurs to provide masks. I don't know that that's actually the case, but you could read it this way. And so now that cost is going to get passed on to the consumer. And one thing I want to go back to with the taking the temperature and then combine it with the mask issue is, while we're doing all of this, who's running the business? How are we making money when we're doing all of this? This is why you need the quarantine cabinet, and you need to be thinking about this right now, because you're going to have no time in June to be thinking about masks, temperature, employees being upset that you're doing all these things. You need a plan now. You need a plan now.
So here's the two big questions that come up for me when it comes, particularly when it comes to masks and the PPE stuff, is A, who pays for it? And then B, right now, where the hell are you going to get these masks from?
Well, that's exactly.
The
answer is, I don't know and nowhere.
Yeah,
that stinks.
Well, it makes it really difficult to start planning these things if there's no clarity on it just yet.
Yeah. Back to the staffing, and then we'll hop into some of the other safety things is, when I look at that person is also coming up with what the training plan is. And Dustin, you really hit the nail on the head. If you're not using this rehiring or this restart as a opportunity to inject culture, you're really missing out on a tremendous opportunity, because worked in restaurants where you have the old guard who does it one way, and then the new guard that's coming in and they're all jazzed. And it's almost like brackish waters, and it just feels, you can feel it in it when you talk with employees or just when you're working through there. So using as a chance to recalibrate and lean into that culture, because we're going to be in an environment where the only thing that is constant is going to be change as we come out of this. And so everybody has to be on the same page and have their hand in the middle of the table saying, yes, we are an agile, nimble, athletic culture that we want to do the best for our team to make sure that everybody has each other's back safely, and then how we adapt to whatever changes come at us, or that we have to evolve. And if you have two different cultures under the same roof, it's going to get very messy very quickly with that. So I think that's really key on there. To the health and safety, kind of that expert, I'd say, we've talked about just a couple on the employee front, but really I think you have to look at it from the entire guest experience, the entire employee experience, the entire vendor experience, and every touch point, and say, what do you do when, and how do we have to revamp that to make it safe? Contactless deliveries. Mm-hmm. I was reading something about just staffing, because if one of your employees tests positive after you've opened, do you have to quarantine everybody for 14 days and your restaurant shut down? That would be devastating. And I was reading one of the, we've listed on the site under discussion or questions, listed a number of resources. And there's a tremendous one by a restaurant company called Black Sheep out of Hong Kong. And they were talking about the operational practices of opening up. But they were saying, you have two different teams. You have the A team and the B team, and they never cross-pollinate. So if you work on an A scheduled day, it's the same team. And on the B team, that they work on these days as separate days, but they never come into contact with each other. So should one of them go out and you have to quarantine, you still have a team that can operate it. Or if there's a manager that goes to multiple restaurants, how do you make sure that you can minimize the number of restaurants that they're going to and isolate it so that they don't bring that to every single restaurant? So I think those are definitely some key areas that I hadn't really thought of, but as you start thinking about it, it's important. What are some others that come to mind from guests or employees or vendors from a health standpoint? As you start?
To the quarantining your teams thing, I think the idea ideally in an ideal world is great. To play devil's advocate a little bit, I start thinking about how social restaurant teams tend to be and how much they love hanging out with one another. So, when you're hiring and you're putting these people into these teams, can you say like, hey, team A, you're not allowed to hang out with team B outside of work? If we're trying to keep everybody separate here, yeah, we might be keeping you separate when you're coming in for your shift, but how much control do we actually have over these people when they're not in the restaurant?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not much.
Well, you don't have as much, but I do think it's telling them the importance of understanding what this means for them, for their safety, their teammates' safety, and the guest safety. And hopefully everyone realizes the magnitude of every decision they make on the overall, we're all in this together as we go through this.
I think it sends a good, going to communication to the consumer and to the outside public, this, team A versus B, whether it's actually going to be perfect. I mean, nothing's going to be perfect, but I hear that and I think, wow, that this is a restaurant that is really taking an aggressive step for safety, and I appreciate that. Like, I'm more likely to go there than a restaurant that doesn't do that. You're trying, you're making an effort.
That goes to the point of, to especially communicating that what your messaging is like to your guests and to your teams is super important, because none of this stuff is going to be perfect, right? Like the masks that people wear in the back, if they're bringing their own, that can't be perfect. These teams being quarantined is not going to ever be perfect, but the more you can do and the more that you can show that you're doing, more importantly, I think the better in this environment. People want to feel, I think guests are going to want to feel safe first and foremost, wherever they go. So even if you're a great restaurant, but you've heard that their practices aren't quite up to par, chances are you're not going to go there, right? You're probably going to go to,
I think on the communication, I think it's important that your internal and your external communications are aligned. And that's going to be critical for the safety, and even something as small as social media. You may be putting up posts of, oh, love to have you back, and you see a picture of a dining room and it's not socially distanced, or someone's not wearing PPE. That tells me as the guest, wait, are they even thinking about that? Are they up with the time? So little things like that are subliminal, and they really, as people are making their first decisions on where do I want to go right when I come back, they want to see that front of mind. And I do think so much is going to change in that process with our guests, is the more information you can get them ahead of time to let them know what that is like, saying, so even if it's like, due to, the social distancing guidelines, we can no longer have people gather in our bar. So we are now reservation only. This is what the procedure will look like when you arrive. And it's over communicating early on, and that will make it much more seamless at the front, rather than have to go through every single, step and change with every single party that's come in. Hopefully they have some of that information ahead of time.
And this goes to one of a comment we have here from Rob Ittner, and something we've discussed on other calls is that, what do we do with a menu? And maybe this kind of goes into this, is, hey, look, at least for the initial point, you're going to order online, or you're going to know what you want. You're going to, with your reservation, you're going to have ordered. Maybe that's not feasible, but it's an idea. Or we're going to do a menu on your phone. So you pull up your own smartphone, and for the time being, you're going to know that you're the only one touching it, and you can pull up the menu, as opposed to passing menus around or spending money on disposable menus. I mean, just different things for the immediate period that customers might be willing to tolerate.
But those are the guidelines that if you can communicate in advance, saying,
exactly,
out of precaution for your safety, we have included a copy of tonight's menu and tonight's wine list. We encourage you to view it by your, on your own device. Yeah. And then at each table, instead of dropping a menu for everybody, do you drop one wine list that's disposable and one menu that's disposable? for guests to view if they need. But those are that's the new type of world. We have to think through those sort of decisions on there.
And we do it with dress codes. There's no reason we can't do it.
Sure.
Use that same idea.
Mhm.
The problem are the restaurants that people don't visit the website prior to eating at. I mean, go to a burger joint.
Instagram, why not? You see enough of those memes about a server throwing glasses at somebody from 6 feet away, but why couldn't a restaurant sort of walk through on Instagram, hey, this is what the new experience, that just so you know what to expect when you come to the restaurant, here's what that looks like, and do a little role play where you see somebody welcoming somebody through all these new steps to help familiarize them. And I think the more that you can familiarize people with them ahead of time, I think it'll make it much more easy for them to get their heads around it before that actual moment they step into the restaurant for the first time.
That's why I love that you kind of included a communications person as part of this quarantine cabinet. I think, it's one thing to kind of figure things out from an operational standpoint of how are we going to do these things? How are we going to pay for these things? What's our new business model going to look like? That all obviously needs to be figured out probably first and foremost. But then secondly, and just as important, is going to be how are you communicating that both to your guests and to your teams? Because in this new landscape, it's going to be really important that everybody internally and externally really understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, the extra level of care that you're taking, because that's going to be what people are looking for at this time. Not to mention that you're not the same restaurant that you were before. You're going to have to do different things that you needed to do, but then the last time you came, it's going to be a little different this time. So let's prep you. Let's prepare you for how this is going to be different and how to do it and how to enjoy it to its fullest potential.
The last thing on communication I'll bring up is translations. I think we work in one of the most diverse industries in the country, which is amazing, but our message is only as good as the way we communicate it to our employees. And so if you have any non-English speakers on your team, how do you have all this communication information translated for them? Because I think it's very important to set them and their coworkers up for success by knowing what to do, the why behind we're doing it, not just what to do, and what to do when, if they get sick, or if they see something, or if they have a question about where I get PPE or what PPE is. I don't think PPE even translates into PPE in most other languages. But anyway, I think those sort of things where they all have the same information, and I think you'll also gain a lot of trust with them. And it's also great from a cultural standpoint to make sure that your message is available to everyone, and that there's an opportunity for those people to ask questions in their language to somebody that can help translate that for them.
Yeah, but we're going to get into some questions here now. Dustin, before we do that, Mike, one of our viewers made a good comment about communication. I just wanted to read it. Said, over communication establishes a trust with your guests and is also very essential to gain trust from your returning staff. Staff communication needs to be a big part of quarantine cabinet goals. I thought that was a great summation there, and I agree with that very much.
Yeah.
Dustin, you want to do some questions?
Well, I got one more thing just on the last one is just the responsible hospitality, kind of the hospitality element of this cabinet, and saying that the way that we deliver hospitality, we rely on a lot of nonverbal and verbal comments, and how you do that with a mask or with a guest with a mask is going to be very different. If you're trying to resolve an issue with a guest, I'm looking for body language at the table, not just a nodding of the head. But if somebody's wearing a mask, it's going to be much harder for me to understand if they understood it, or are they just blowing me off and it's not resonating. So I think that's very key. And other touch points along the way, whether it's dropping the check, how are people signing that? Are you giving them clean pens, wiping things down? Going into the restrooms is something that just kind of popped into my head the other day, where you see so many places that have the air dryers that you put your hands under. When you think about how the virus has spread, those, a lot of those are hardwired. How do you turn them off? How do you switch those out? But little things like that are going to say, wow, they really thought about everything, and I feel safe coming here because I know they're looking out for my best interest. And so
yeah, I think you really need to kind of take a look at the entire guest experience from top to bottom and walk through it as a guest in your own restaurant, and think of all the various touch points and how can you you know, convey hospitality while also making sure you're hitting the standards of being sanitary and being safe, and making sure guests are taken care of from that point of view as well. So you got to think of everything, right? Like, what's the guest going to experience when they first walk in the door, when they sit down, what's on the table, what are they looking at? You know, they have to get up and go to the bathroom. What that's going to feel like, what's it going to feel like to have the servers dropping my food off at the table. You know, every single little touch point needs to be thought through. Otherwise, you could be leaving yourself open up for a criticism.
And there's going to be some amazing ways to weave hospitality in there in new ways.
There's opportunity in there too, to be creative and look on top of your shit and be a pro.
I remember at Ajax Tavern, Dustin, I think you'd appreciate this. One of the biggest wins and kind of nods of hospitality from a bald person to a bald person was, you know, we had this beautiful patio at the Little Nell, sun's beating down, people sitting outside, and you walk up to a bald person, you give them a small little jar of sunscreen and a little wink, and they were like, that's like the secret handshake. And so maybe that's sanitizer in this new normal that we're heading into. But there are little ways that you can weave that hospitality in there. But it's really this whole cabinet working together, modeling it, understanding it, communicating it, and starting out on the same page, so that as you start to fold in your team, that it's going to be important that everybody's on the same page and speaking the same language.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's definitely important to think about it from the guest perspective. Just going back up these comments just a little bit, Rob Ittner makes an interesting point here. He says all single-use condiments, salt and pepper. You know, so you got to think about, if you're a restaurant that normally keeps things on the table, yeah, you could definitely go and sanitize that table in between each turn, right? But the new guest that sits down, do they know you did that? Do they know that you did a good job doing that? You know, they're going to be way more skeptical than ever about what's happened on that table prior to their arrival. So I think, you know, you got to think about it from a skeptical point of view as well. Like, maybe single-use stuff is the way to go.
Think about why we wrap straws. We didn't used to wrap straws in a little thing that you hit, you know, but now everything's wrapped, and that, you know, that happened decades ago, but because, okay, safety first, let's wrap it. And everyone's upset. And I understand that there's a lot of extra plastic and paper, but each utensil is wrapped for a reason.
Mm-hmm. And I think of, you know, going to sushi restaurants, they give you the hot towel.
Yeah.
And that could be something that doing that now for guests and giving them a hot towel to wipe down. Maybe that's a nice little added touch that you can do to help them sanitize, or give them the bottle of sanitizer, then go around with it. I saw some comment about the communication with your eyes, and I can see one of those, you know, training exercises when you're bringing people back on, something to do with charades, how you play charades now with, you know, not being able to talk, but how to read body language and understand what guests are feeling and how to resolve.
Give me two. Want to ask a couple questions here?
Yeah, let's see what we've got.
Okay.
Ivers is here. So he says, what are your thoughts on some restaurateurs saying it's too expensive to just open at 50% occupancy, and say we will just stay closed and wait it out until they can open to full capacity? You know, I read that, and I think, you know, it really depends on your cash position and what your financial position looks like, and whether you have the opportunity to wait that out. You know, that's another option of, like, you know, what you're doing with this PPP money. If you take a couple $100,000 and you just decide you want to stay closed for a while, you know, you got to know that that's going to convert to a loan, but maybe that gives you the cushion that you need to kind of wait things out a little bit longer. Yeah, I think it's a very restaurant per restaurant situation. Sab, you're probably the best person to answer this question, though. How would you look at that?
No, I think you nailed it on the head out of the gate. It's really cash flow is what's going to determine that. And let's assume that you're in a decent cash flow position. Maybe you got some PPP and you're not looking to get it forgiven. Maybe you apply that for rent, and that can buy you a couple months until you get a few of the restrictions pulled back. However, I think if you're just looking at it, 50% occupancy, and this is one of the challenges, is that I think every state is going to be different. You know, it might be, is it no parties above 4? Is it tables 6 feet apart? Is it half of your occupancy? Is it 10 people per 500 square feet? that's the unknown of it. And that's why you need to have someone help model every different scenario for it. But I think if you're just looking at a 50% occupancy, you have to say, what can I do to be profitable with 50% inside my four-wall occupancy? And then go to that a la carte list of pivot options. And then how do you layer those on there? Because you can't just look at it, well, 50% seats, and that's what I got to work with.
Right. I'm throwing in the towel. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because you also have to expect, maybe it's 50% occupancy right now. Maybe they start to lift that in a month or two, couple months, but we don't know that for sure. That 50% could be in place until there's a vaccine, for instance. So, you kind of almost have to plan, like, if I'm thinking about staying closed, how long could I feasibly stay closed? You're at some point, you're probably still going to want to start thinking through those a la carte options of how to drive some extra revenue, looking at these other ways to make money, seeing if it's feasible.
And I think you need multiple plans. Here's the 50% for a year plan. Here's the 50% for 6 months plan. And then here's what we do. And you're going to have a stack of them, and you're going to have to just be flexible and know that an order can change. God forbid we have to lock down again.
Yep.
We're not prepared for that.
To Salvador's point, though, each state is going to be a little bit different. So it is a little difficult to plan perfectly right now, just because if you're in a state where they haven't come out with any protocols yet, you just aren't sure what you can and what you can't do.
Sure.
I know in Georgia, we just looked at their 10 patrons for every 500 square feet. So that's not including staff, obviously, that's just patrons. So at least you can start to look at that and start to build a model around that, because you know what you can and what you can't do. They require 6 feet between each table. There's no tables can be larger than a party of 6. So at least me as a business owner, I can say, okay, that's my kind of foundation to be able to work with. Then how do I start to layer on these other things on top of that?
I know we're about out of time, but one question here was asking about EEOC compliance with rehiring. I just wanted to touch briefly on that. Don't let standards fly out the window here. You do, as you rehire folks and as you go back through the rehiring process, keep in mind you do have, you've got to be very careful as to how you're retaining folks, and you're not discriminating against anybody in the process or treating anybody unfairly, even unintentionally. Just those are things to keep in mind. We're living in a crazy COVID world where you kind of feel like there are no rules. I'll just do whatever I want. No. Don't do that. Good faith, good business judgment. Retain staff that for a reason. And if it just shakes out a certain way, okay. But be very careful on who you're firing and rehiring. You still need to look at that in the same way as you did 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just close one thing to tie up what Dustin said and also tease something here. I think one of the big frustrations that I heard from a lot of restaurateurs in Georgia was they announced that it was going to be opening today on Monday, and they said guidelines coming. And the guidelines I don't think came out till Thursday night. And when you look at this, and if you want to be responsible and say, okay, if you're going to be coming back and be on part of my team, I need you to quarantine ahead of time to make sure that you're safe. I need to understand what the restrictions you've put on our business are, so I know how to order, how to write my menu. That was very frustrating. And so the more that you can start to read and look into how other states are dealing with it, you can start thinking about how that might impact your restaurant in your state as you go through it. We've added some great resources on there. Want to call out a couple by name, and they've been really great about open sourcing these for people to share. And that's the one from Black Sheep in Hong Kong. There's one from a company out of New Orleans in New York called Oyster Sunday, and they have critical paths that you can download and fill in yourself. The NRA guidelines are up there from a health and safety standpoint, and we'll keep on adding those as they come in so that we can have a resources. And maybe 75% of it applies to you, and that's great. The other 25%, it gets your mind thinking. So definitely use those. And if you come across any, please share them with us, because we'd love to hear what's out there and see what's going on, not just in the US, but around the world.
And one thing as a lawyer, have to touch on this because you brought it up. With no guidance or with orders from the state upon that we have to look at for reopening, keep in mind that from a liability perspective, one of my favorite things to do is to see if you broke a rule. And if I think that if somebody got sick or somebody got hurt, and the first thing I can do to say is, restaurant, you broke a rule, and because you broke that rule, this employee or guest got hurt. You better scour those guidelines. And this is tedious, and I feel bad for everybody involved. I feel bad for myself because I represent so many restaurants. I'll be looking at the guidelines. But if it says everybody's got to wear a special mask, and you let them wear a different mask, and somebody got hurt, I'm going to look to that rule right away as a lawyer, and I'm going to say, did you follow this rule? No. Okay, well then, per se, you're negligent or something to that effect. Just keep that in mind. These rules are even if they're not mandatory and just guidelines, I'd want to follow them from a liability perspective. You can't follow everything all the time. I get it. You got to do your best, but keep that in mind. Read the rules. The Georgia ones were tedious, but you got to read them. That's my spiel. Nickel's worth of free advice.
A little after 3, so maybe we wrap it up.
Yeah.
All right. You want to take them out, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. This has been great. We certainly hope that you feel it being beneficial to you. We love your questions. Keep in mind that all of the episodes are available on YouTube. Go back, watch them anytime. And the discussion page is really something we're trying to foster. Your questions are important to us, and we want to make sure that we're responding to those and keeping the discussion going. This is Freerun. We only want the best discussion. We've been fortunate so far. We've only had great discussion. So please subscribe, tell your friends about us. We do expect to build this community over, forever, and we want you to be a part of it. So thank you, everybody. Sabato, Dustin, thank you so much. Everybody stay safe and pay attention to those guidelines and to the new PPP rules if and when they come out. So long.
Thanks, everyone.